Today we're going to talk about, on this panel, we're going to talk about perspectives from the House and the Senate. And we are joined by Senator Lankford, Representative Stutzman, and Representative DeSantis, and Senator Flake will be joining us soon. What we have on this panel is two senators who were previous members of the House, who were fantastic conservatives in the House and have been fantastic conservatives in the Senate. And we have two aspiring senators on this panel as well. So I think one of the things that we want to talk about is how to kind of engender cross-chamber coordination. There's no doubt that there is a major difference between the House and the Senate, at least culturally. I mean, if you look at the Senate and you walk through the halls of, the Russell Senate office building, it's a lofty place, no doubt. Senators come in with the backing of an entire state. They're staffed up with 30 to 40 staffers. It is different. In the House, you go in and it's the place of the people, people dress differently. It's more casual. They're closer to their constituents in many ways, but I wouldn't say that with these perspectives.
I think Marlin's tie is better than mine.
They have better ties, yeah. But it's just different culture, and that is by design, right? I mean, this is our founders gave this to us for a reason. They're supposed to perform different roles in our government. But one of the things, the premise of this panel that we want to put forward is that the conservatives in the House and the conservatives in the Senate have far more in common with one another than they do with their fellow representatives or their fellow senators. And as such, it is good for the conservative movement to actually help these guys coordinate across the chambers. And we've seen some fantastic things that can be accomplished when they actually are able to coordinate across the chambers. We've seen the rise of the Republican Study Committee, the House Freedom Caucus, and the Senate Steering Committee, and the kind of informal collaboration that has begun to happen between those bodies has been the kind of force for good in the Congress, where the House guys can take a bold stand, and a few senators can get up and echo that bold stand in the Senate, and really cement a policy position. So I want to explore this dynamic a little bit on this panel, and we'll get into some of the specific policies and specific places where they're doing that. But first, I'd like each of our panelists to take a few minutes to just kind of share their perspective on this particular topic, and then we'll go into questions. So we'll start right here with Senator Lankford.
Well, thanks. Glad to be able to visit. Let me speak very briefly, which will be rare for a senator to do. I don't come from a political background. I was 22 years in ministry, working with middle school, high school, and college-age students before I came to Congress. This is what my wife calls life's greatest interruption for us, something that we did not anticipate at any point, but really felt called to do it. Served 4 years in the House of Representatives. Marlin and I actually came in the same class in 2010. And so as walking into that was a sense of engaging. You learn initially the House rules, and the House rules function like almost everything else in life. If you have the majority, you're the majority, you do what you want. We came in and established a new majority. That was a very exciting time to be able to watch the gavel shift. We're in a majority time period, and it functioned very similar to everything else I'd seen. 2014, I ran for the United States Senate, won the Senate, and you walk into an entirely different world. To show you how far and how deep that this really goes, my wife and I and our two daughters, I have daughters 15 and 19, the weekend before I was sworn into the Senate, we came up a few days early and thought one of the best things that we could do as a family was to quietly drive up to Philadelphia and go to Congress Hall just as tourists, to be able to walk through Congress Hall and to be able to be there. And we went through the Independence Hall. We went downstairs in the House area where I had been before, but I'd actually never been upstairs in Congress Hall, to the upper chamber. And in Congress Hall from 1790, and it's all set up like it was in 1790 to 1800 where Congress met there, downstairs is wooden benches, fireplaces in the corner, very open wooden floors, very simple, straightforward. You take the staircase upstairs to the Senate chambers. It is a hand-done carpet with the brand new national symbol in it, beautiful draperies and chandeliers scattered around each individual desk that look just like the desks we have in the Senate now. And you realize in 1790, these were two different bodies. And it reinforces to you again the differences in the founding. What Madison always said was this was going to be a place of distinction and debate. That cooling saucer, as George Washington announced it at the earliest parts, is still there and still functioning. Now the problem is we've had a breakdown in how we actually operate day to day. We should make it hard to pass a law. We are a nation where the states should pass the majority of the laws, not the federal government. If we have a system where the House and the Senate look alike, they react the same way, and it's a very efficient process to make a law. But this should not be about efficiencies of cranking out multiple bills. This should be about debate and deliberation, and the founders actually set up a body where the two do not think alike, and you hammer on each other, and whatever is left at the end of that actually comes out. And it's hopefully a good statute, though we all know some very obvious examples of bad statutes coming out. So the hope is that we can actually continue to still work this system. I think we've lost some of the constitutional passion on this, but it can be regained, and I hope we can get a chance to talk through some of that as well. So
Thank you,
that's
Senator.
us.
Congressman Stutzman.
Well, thank you, Tim. It's great to be here with you this afternoon, and appreciate Heritage Action hosting this great forum for a discussion about the conservative movement. I am excited about the conservative movement today, in spite of the fact that Barack Obama's been president over the past 7 years, and we've seen a huge change to this country that he had said that was going to happen under his presidency. I'm excited about the movement again, and that conservatives have been called to action and are making a difference in the political races around the country already, and we're seeing it at the state level. And so I'm going to be optimistic about the future of this country. And so it's a pleasure for me to be here. I've always appreciated Heritage, and they're the gold standard, I believe, for conservatism. I never expected to be in politics, similar to what James said. I've been in politics longer. I, first of all, am a farmer, and then I was also in the trucking business. And so my brothers often tease me that I've gone from being a farmer to a truck driver to a politician. I'm not really moving up the food chain in the right direction here. But it's been a great honor. Right after 9/11 happened, our oldest son, Peyton, being from Indiana, Peyton's a very popular name considering football in Indiana, but Peyton was 3 weeks old when 9/11 happened, and I felt like I needed to do something. My wife, Christy, and I decided to get involved locally, and I eventually served in the state house and then also in the state senate. So this topic is interesting even at the state level, where the House and the Senate are very two different bodies, even at the state level and here at the federal level. I think it's even more stark, even though not serving in the Senate, talking to friends and colleagues in the Senate, that it does work much differently than what it does in the House. Being a House member, we want to get things done. We want to get a budget passed. We want to start reducing the deficit and the debt. And I know that's what we all want as conservatives, but we're much more anxious to get started. And I don't know what happens to these guys when they go over there, but hopefully we'll have the opportunity to serve again. But I know that the structure is set up in a way for the House to be very responsive, and especially with 2-year terms versus 6-year terms, it does change the perspective. While I agree that we're here for discussion and debate, and it is hard and it should be hard to pass bills, it shouldn't be impossible to pass bills. And so I think that's where we're at today, where the American public is frustrated with Washington because of the results. We can talk about process, because I do think we need process changes, but at the end of the day, it's about the results. And we are at $19 trillion of debt. CBO just announced this last week that we're headed towards $30 trillion of debt in the next 10 years. The results are grim, and so that's why we have to find a way between the House and the Senate to work together as conservatives to get conservative results so that we get our country back on track. And so a lot of the process changes that we talk about, or processes that we talk about today, can help us to get the right results. So great to be here with you, and again, thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, Congressman DeSantis.
Well, thanks for having me, Tim. I think it's an interesting subject. On the one hand, the founders designed the Constitution in order to have differences between the House and Senate, because they knew wherever one branch had a lot of power, there was danger to the liberties of the people. And they believed that was true if you vote people in, just as if you had a king who was one person. And so they thought that the House would be the immediate representatives of the people. They would be pushing for the current passions of the day. The Senate would have a longer term. Of course, they were elected indirectly at the time. And that they would take a little bit more of a longer view about the national interest. And so there are times when the House and Senate are at odds, and frankly, that's probably by design. Of course, there are certain things that only concern the Senate. I think if you look coming up after this next presidential election, there's going to be more national security issues that are going to be front and center. We see the Iran deal's failures. You're going to potentially see 4 Supreme Court justices nominated over the next 4 to 8 years. And, in the House, that's certainly of interest to the House, but that is really, those issues are really going to be in the province of the Senate. But on the other hand, the founders also believed that each branch would have a self-interest to defend its own turf. And so when the legislative authority was threatened, they really believed that the House and Senate would be working together to combat overreach by either the executive or the judicial branch. And they assumed it would be the executive branch because they thought the courts would be so weak. And I think that's been a major failure if you look at the last several years. I think Harry Reid, the way he's run the Senate, is he subordinated the institutional interest of the Congress to his partisan interest and, more broadly, the partisan interest of President Obama. And so he's deliberately taken actions that have undermined Congress's ability to wield the power of the purse. And I think the result is that the executive is much more powerful than what the founding fathers would have envisioned, and that what would be good in a limited constitutional government. And so having a Senate that is working with the House to reestablish our power over the budget and our power over the purse, I think has constitutional significance. We talk about the different issues about defunding the EPA rule, this rule, and those are all important. But the larger issue, I think, is even more important because it affects the structure of the Constitution moving forward. And then I do think there are policy interests that, to have conservatives in both chambers working together. We came in the 90s close to doing a balanced budget amendment. I don't think you're ever going to solve the debt unless you have that, because we can all agree on maybe doing it, a good budget, but subsequent Congresses are going to unwind that, and we've seen that over and over again, the itch to spend. So I'd love to be able to take a stab at that and see if we can, how close we are to 2/3, doing things like reining in the bureaucracy. I mean, that's got to be done thoughtfully. You got to lay a lot of groundwork between both chambers, but clearly the bureaucracy is too unaccountable right now and is doing way too much legislating. And then finally, tax and welfare reform. I mean, those big things, I think you have to be working together. And so having those ideas, exchanging the ideas amongst the chambers, I think is important to get a product that ultimately reflects conservative principles.
Thank you, Congressman. Senator Flake.
Well, thanks. Sorry for arriving a little late. I served 12 years in the House and then came to the Senate, and there is a difference. It was really, I obviously knew constitutionally the differences, but once you get in the Senate and you experience the frustration that we felt over the past couple of years, it is very different. The customs, precedents are much different, and that I appreciate and like and endorse. But some of the behavioral problems that we've had in the Senate, just not allowing legislation to get to the floor and not experiencing what is supposed to be the greatest deliberative body in the world, has been extremely frustrating. When I was in the House over a period of 4 or 5 years going after earmarks, I came to the House floor several hundred times with specific amendments to try to strike individual spending items. That was during an open amendment process. And although my leadership, and this is when Republicans were in charge most of that time, and leadership could have stopped me. There are rules, there are ways in which they can stop that, but they never did. They hated it. They hated it with a passion, but they never exercised their prerogative because the custom had always been that we have an open amendment process and people can come in. When the Democrats came in, then they shut down that process almost completely. But we didn't do that, and that's what we need, I think, more than anything else in the Senate. It's not necessarily rules changes, it's behavioral changes to get back at least till we have a point where we can debate this legislation and let it come to the floor, and most of all, appropriations measures. And as conservatives who believe in limited government, if we want to limit government, we've got to use the power of the purse. That's what we've got. But in order to do that, you have to have a process where you're allowed to vote on appropriations measures one by one. Then you can exercise the leverage that you need because you can get bipartisan support for some of these reductions, and particularly challenges to the regulatory state. But if you wait until the end of the year and have one vote up or down, you've lost all of your leverage, and politically you just can't do it. So I would argue that we've got to have some behavioral changes. I think our leadership is committed to do that. We'll have more of a semblance of regular order this year, but we've got a long ways to go.
Great. Thank you, Senator. Okay, great. A lot to talk about. Representative DeSantis brought up the idea that Harry Reid is kind of subordinating the institution to political partisanship. I think that's very clear. What are some areas that each of you would suggest are ways that we can kind of unpeel that onion? And I think that it's going to be difficult because when you say Republicans get the Senate next year, it's going to be hard to kind of willingly divest yourself of some of that power if we have a conservative in the White House as well. Maybe we could start with Senator Flake. You could talk a little bit about the Article 1 project that you all are launching. I think that kind of speaks to this, and then others can chime in.
Right. Well, the Article 1 project, which we launched today, that's an initiative really thought up by people like Mike Lee and Jeb Hensarling and myself and a few others, and we launched it today, basically with the notion that Congress has ceded a lot of territory to the executive branch over the years, whether it's Republicans in the White House or Democrats. It's been kind of a nonpartisan thing in terms of pushing authority toward the White House, and what we're looking for is ways to reinvigorate and to get back to the constitutional balance that we had in the beginning. And a lot of that has to do, obviously, with fully exercising the power of the purse. And we even before the more recent behavioral issues that we've had in the Senate over the past decade, we were ceding far too much authority. And I would submit that it's not just on some of the spending items, it's on some of the other issues as well. We haven't authorized this president for the campaign against ISIS. We've simply said, oh, there's the old AUMF, or authorization of use of force from 2001. That's sufficient, I think, as conservatives. And as Republicans, we ought to say, no, that's our prerogative, and we ought to take the initiative. But certainly on the spending items, if you look at the Federal Register, which was printed Monday through Friday, has anywhere from 100 to 1,000 pages a day, 4,000 new regulations every year, 2,700 new proposals for regulations. And most of them just move right on without any congressional approval up or down. And we've got to grab hold of that again, and that's what the project is all about.
Great. Anyone else on that one?
Well, if there's a Republican president, I mean, there are going to be certain conservative things that individual can do through the bureaucracy if they want to. And I think where the rubber meets the road for guys like us is if they're pursuing your policy interests in a way that's not really consistent with the constitutional design. Are you going to choose your oath of office over your ideology and your political desires? And I think guys up here probably would do that, but it's not easy to do that. And it's also hard to say, well, wait a minute. Obama just does executive actions. Why should we operate under different rules? And so, once you start going back and forth with that, it becomes very difficult to put the horse back in the barn. But I think the power of the purse, obviously, but then just the way Congress legislates. I mean, we give these guys power to do all this. Very rare. I mean, we're not really making these determinations about what the law should say. We're saying we think this is important. Now you figure it out, bureaucracy. Well, you're inviting them to expand their power. And so that's been the fault of Congress. If you look at how a lot of this stuff is even done through a lot of the committees, a lot of these bills are pre-cooked to have their outcome determined. There's not really a robust debate. A lot of the chairmen will not want to have an open process, even though technically you can do that. By the time it gets to the House floor, we'll see how open the process is going forward. I think it's been better under Paul, and I think he's committed to doing that. But there'll be times when if you have an open process, things can get a little bit off the course you want it to go. And so are you going to let us go ahead and do that? But if you're actually legislating, it takes a lot more work, and you have to make many more determinations. And so the citizens should know if we pass a bill, what that means for them. Instead, it's like they pass a bill, then you got to wait for all these regulations to come out. And then even bills that have been on the books for decades, all of a sudden, just new policies, all of a sudden will emanate. And that there's no accountability for that type of government. So we have to do it, but there may be times when the president of our own party is going in a direction, and we got to put the brakes on it.
I would say that, personnel does equal policy and process. It depends on who is in leadership that allows for a process. Senator Flake mentioned taking amendments to the floor and actually having a debate on them. And we've seen since the 2010 class came in, We had an open process right at the beginning on one of the first budget bills, but after that, it started to become much more limited. And that's where the Freedom Caucus really kind of grew out of, a frustration that here, 434 of us, besides the Speaker of the House, come to Washington, D.C., leave families at home and come to do the work. And oftentimes, once we get to Washington, find out here's the bill that was negotiated over the weekend. You have a couple of days to vote on it, and we've been pretty much excluded from the process. I don't believe that's what the founders wanted at all. They wanted debate. They wanted discussion. They wanted that argument. That's where we were going to get a better result. And unfortunately, and I think that's why Congress is weaker today than it has been for a long time, is because of the failure of that, leaving it to, well, for example, Dodd-Frank, when it was passed back in 2009, we left thousands of unwritten rules to the fourth branch of government to let the bureaucracies, to let the experts make these rules, and look at the mess that we have today. I mean, the burdensome regulations on our economy today are suffocating the economy. CBO just came out and said that our economy has, in the fourth quarter grew at about 0.7%. And we continue to go downward rather than a growing economy, which is also hurting our budget. So having an open process, and the Freedom Caucus was really behind that, and being a member of that, and also being a member that voted against John Boehner Speaker, because I felt that the process wasn't open enough. It wasn't personal, it was about process. And if we don't open it up, and I hope that Speaker Ryan is willing to move to an open process, you'll have people bringing amendments to the floor. There's times you hate to vote on particular amendments. You just hate it. How are you going to go back home and answer? But that's what we're here for, to cast votes on very tough issues.
Mm-hmm. Let me run just a couple things on this, very specific. You've got two issues here. It's not just Article 1 power, but it's also getting power back to the people, to the voice. That's part of what we've lost, is that people have lost their voice, and they feel like no matter who they elect, when they get to the Senate especially, nothing changes because you have this 3/5 rule to actually open up debate that's being used. So if you have to have 60 to even debate something, they would say, why don't you even debate this? Run over them, you're in the majority, just go attack it and do it, and you realize you can't. Based on the basic functioning of the Senate, you can't even open this up for debate. The Planned Parenthood bill is a good example of that. The first week of August, that was my bill that we actually brought to the Senate floor. We brought it out there, we had 55 votes. We literally cannot open it for debate. That looks like that would be an obvious thing to be able to do. That is a process issue in the basic functioning. I am a firm protector of the filibuster, but I think the filibuster is used when you are what it was designed for originally and what it was set up for at the very beginning. In 1917, when it was put in place on the cloture motion, it was designed to be set up to say when it's time to end debate, we all agree it's time to end debate, we end it. Now we have this motion to proceed fight that we can't even debate something. There are 260 votes. Most people don't know this. There are 260 votes on every bill, to get on it and to get off of it. There's no reason to have it on the beginning in the way it's currently used. Have it at the end, protect the power of the minority as we do, but let's get on it and let's debate it. Let's take those hard votes. Let's actually get amendments out there, because most of those as conservatives, we know we're right, don't we? We're going to win the argument if it actually gets to the floor and we actually debate it, and other people will nod their head and go, okay, I'm embarrassed, I'm going to vote for this. I don't want to do it, but it's the right thing to do, and we'll win the argument. So we've got to be able to get to that point. We have to deal with judicial issues as well. In 1984, there was a Supreme Court decision called the Chevron decision. That Chevron decision made a decision when a law is ambiguous, who gets the ability to be able to interpret it? Is it the courts? Is it the legislative branch? Is it the executive branch? In 1984, in the Chevron decision, the courts determined the executive branch are the experts in that area. They get deference to interpret where the law is ambiguous. Our frustration with the president right now circles around, he's going back and taking old laws, 20, 30, 40 years old, reinterpreting them in brand new ways, and the courts are giving him deference to continue to do that. Until we correct that Chevron decision, we're going to continue to fight the courts, which keep deferring. So we're putting out vague laws. The courts are giving deference to them. That combination the two continues to accelerate the power of the executive. We have to solve that. Our office is actually working on real solutions to solve the Chevron deference issue, because if we don't get that back, we don't ever get ahead of the stack.
Very good. I'd like to open it up to questions here and just make one quick observation. I think what you're saying about the power of the people is tremendously important for this conversation. It reminds me of what I think was one of the best examples of cross-collaboration between the chambers over the last decade, and that was on the earmark fight that Senator Flake referenced earlier. I mean, that was a remarkable victory for conservatives, but it happened because members of the House and members of the Senate were frequently playing off one another, and they were playing off one another to go over the heads of Congress, to go over the problems with the process in Congress directly to the American people. There was an entire online movement of bloggers, I don't know if you remember it, called Pork Busters that grew up out of that, and they all became famous bloggers and are doing different things now. That movement launched lots of people's political careers. Jim DeMint became a figure during that movement. You became a figure during that movement. Senator Coburn became a figure during that movement. And that was all because of the two chambers working together and going over the heads of Congress. And we always say here at Heritage Action, we always use that Milton Friedman quote, that what we're trying to do is we're trying to create he said what we need to do is create a climate of opinion so that the wrong people do the right thing. And that's what we're trying to do, and that's what the kind of cross-collaboration between the two chambers can do, and I think that was a great example of it. Let's go to questions. Yes, sir, right here.
My name is M.D. Karim. I am from Maryland. My question, when U.S. Constitution is enacted, then it was Republican Constitution. Economy was also capitalism. But by the time of Constitution turns to democratic, but economy does not go to transfer to democracy. So there is a contradiction, and government overexercise for to provide democratic economic rights. How you will reconcile? Make the economy democratic or make the Constitution Republican?
The economy? I mean, I think your question is centering around capitalism and a republic versus...
Now, U.S. Constitution is democratic.
Right.
But economy is capitalism.
Right.
Capitalism means unequal rights. Democracy means equal rights. So
Understood.
there is a contradiction.
Any perspectives on that?
I'm ready to stick with it.
Yeah.
I think I'll stick with capitalism. I'm not sure of what inconsistencies there are, but
Well, I mean, I think that I think that the question is around the idea of a republic versus a democracy.
Well,
and our founders wanting a republic, and capitalism functions in a republic where you have a certain kind of citizenry.
It really circles around, and not to use a heritage term here, it really circles around opportunity for all.
Right.
The ability for everyone to engage in every part of the economy and each person to also engage in political life. We are not a democracy in that all voices or take all votes. We don't do a broad, we have a representative republic, but each person is involved in that one as well. That goes back to my statement as well. If the voices are cut out based on the executive branch deciding they're going to run over everybody in a regulatory scheme, the elected officials that are supposed to speak for the people in their states are cut out, and we lose that. So it's opportunity to rise and opportunity for all is a key.
Yes, sir.
Okay. At what point does the supremacy of the federal government trump the alleged power, unlimited power of state legislatures? And I'm asking that specifically about the national popular vote issue, which is really coming on strong in all the states. And coming from Senator Flake's state, we faced it this week with the election committee. It got approved 5-1 with 4 Republicans, 3 out of 4 Republicans voting for it. It cleared the Rules Committee within 2 hours after that. It's going then to debate. And so this is what you call super fast track. And yet, where do states now with federal, where does the break come with the federal government? The states have power to change the wishes of the constituents of that state and take the wishes of that state across state lines.
Yep. Thoughts?
Well,
Go ahead.
I would say this, I mean, as a believer in the 10th Amendment, as a believer that the states created the federal government. We've already moved away from the original intention of how senators were elected, instead of by the state legislators, rather by popular vote. I think that the Electoral College has to be protected. I do believe that, I mean, honestly, has to be protected. I mean, this again it is the states that elect our federal officials through, specifically our president, through the Electoral College. I think if we go to a popular vote, we're again moving away from the state, from federalism, and for the states to be the foundation of our federal government. And unfortunately, that's not.
I would suggest that everybody here, I mean, it's raising its head in Oklahoma. But this is a serious issue.
It is a very big issue.
And we're not going to have a Republican Party. We're not going to have a Democratic Party. We're going to have a party what I call moochers and looters party.
Yeah, well, and I would say to balance that, a counter to the movement is the convention of states that Senator Coburn is involved with. I don't think Washington's going to fix itself. It's going to take states and people across this country that are going to fix Washington.
People do get involved, but states still have to ratify any change to the Constitution. And we're not used to it because we think about Electoral College, it's just something. Well, it would also be the federal Constitution when we deal with Electoral College as well and how that functions. The challenge that we have is that in our generation, we're not used to the Electoral College. It's something that happens a couple of months after the election and no one even watches it. We were in the House when the Electoral College ballots were counted and everything else after the last very depressing election that we had for president. But if you go back to Andrew Jackson, he won the popular vote in his first run and did not become president because it was thrown into the House of Representatives and they picked someone different on that. Now, he retaliated 4 years later by winning. But we're not used to seeing that. We don't see that anymore.
What are you going to do to fix it?
You know what? I think states are going to fix that. I have confidence in a lot of our conservative states.
You got a lot more confidence than I do.
I do have some confidence in the voters. I am with
The
the.
voters don't get anything to say about it.
They will. I am as confident on the voters, and I don't second guess my voters. Kind of like not second guessing your own wife. I don't second guess my wife's choices because I was one of them. So. There is some respect for people, and as we move as Americans.
Last thing I'll say is, the people of a state, be it Arizona or whatever, it doesn't matter. We have nothing to say about it. It's controlled exclusively by the state legislators. That's a simple fact.
Okay, over here. Yes, sir.
This is addressed both to Senator Lankford and Senator Frank. In light of all of the conservative reforms that you're talking about, how can you possibly continue to support filibusters before, during, or after when you know, to a provable fact, you will never get any major conservative reform legislation through the Senate if you allow the Democrats to filibuster something? Only if it's 51 votes will you ever get tax reform, entitlement reform, reforming the bureaucracy, which I think is most important. You need to change the civil service laws so that bureaucrats, career bureaucrats, can be fired very easily.
Sure.
None of this will ever happen as long as anything other than a simple majority of the Senate can decide to take up legislation or after some reasonable period end debate with 51 votes, not 60.
You want to start on that, Jeff?
I'll just say, George Will had a good column a while ago where he detailed, and I hadn't seen somebody do the research, but since World War II, Democrats have controlled both chambers in the White House for 22 years since that period. Republicans for only 6. We may have the good fortune to control the White House and both chambers this time, but it won't last long. It always changes. And I think, as frustrating as it is at times, for those of us who believe in limited government, we're protected more by a system that moves slowly than one that is more efficient. Take right-to-work laws, for example. Those, if we had not had the filibuster and were not able to protect right-to-work laws in states a few years ago, those would be gone. So yes, it's tempting, it's frustrating to look at a situation like we have today, controlling both chambers and not being able to get things to the president's desk. But I fear worse the time that we aren't in control of either chamber of the White House and what would be done.
But then what you have to do is win the next election and say, look at all the terrible things that they did, put us in charge, and we're going to repeal them, and with a simple majority, you can do just that.
I don't buy that. I think sometimes when these things get in, they're very difficult to get rid of. And I think we found that with kind of the entitlements that we have that are very difficult to reform now.
So let me say a couple things on that. One is you win the argument. There is some benefit to getting onto a bill, getting out to debate. You win the argument, and you win people over to your side. One of my favorite letters from Thomas Jefferson that's out there is a letter that he wrote in 1790 to a pastor that was considering running for Congress, and he had asked Thomas Jefferson to endorse him and to help him run for Congress. And Jefferson said he didn't know if he wanted to be able to do that, but he mentioned a couple of things in that letter. He said, you are the type of congressman that I ought to want because you understand that liberty is won by inches and that we'll have to move along, and that the way that we move good men to understand what is right for them is to be able to win the debate. There is a power in actually saying, well, if we win an election one time, we ram it down people's throats. The president has learned, though I don't think very well, what happened with Obamacare, that when he had the supermajority and he rammed Obamacare through, and then he has lost elections all over the country. I don't know what it's like in your state. The president's been the best recruiter for the Republican Party that we've ever seen, far better than Reagan was. People are changing their registration from Democrat to Republican under this president, and it's been a huge sweep because of that rapid change. There's a real benefit to our system as a nation to not have rapid changes every 2 years, but to have some level of consistency. But if we get on the bill and we can open up for debate, we can win the argument.
I would just add to that. I mean, 95% of legislation is garbage. And at the end of the day, you need to be able to have some mechanism to slow that down. And so the filibuster is indeed important. But there is another thing that we haven't mentioned here on this. You're right that we are going to have to do some sweeping reforms in 2017 should we be so fortunate as to win the White House and the House and the Senate. And if we're in that position, we need to be prepared as a movement to use the budget reconciliation instructions to pass what we need to pass with 51 votes in the United States Senate. And so you can do that. The rules of the Senate are that you can do that once a year right now. And so you could do that. You can do two major pieces in in the first 2 years. That could be tax reform, it could be repeal of Obamacare, things like that. And then you do have to go out and win the argument on the other things. I mean, the House right now is talking about a welfare reform bill. Let's go out and have the argument about whose policies on welfare reform are actually better for the American people, and have Harry Reid try to filibuster that. Let's do a school choice bill and have Harry Reid try to filibuster that. That's not a bad dynamic. It's a good dynamic to have them trying to hold that stuff up in the Senate, because it makes the argument that you need reinforcement troops in the next midterm election. I think that we have time for one more question. Right here. Whoever just said please, they sounded desperate.
Senator, thank you for the Chevron comment. Swiss cheese legislation or vague legislation combined with Chevron deference is a Article 1 killer. And I would add to that, if you could comment, please, on benefit cost. The regulation can't be just the Wicked Witch of the West waving the regulatory wand by the agencies.
So I know this is final question. Let me make a comment on that, and then a quick final statement as well. One of the things that I've tried to work through is for the independent agencies to have the same requirement as the other executive agencies. One of those key areas is the benefit cost analysis. If they're not required to do it and they don't have to live by the formula, and their formula of how they determine that isn't public, which is the other one, they'll say, well, we determine the cost benefit, but you can't see all the background formula. It's proprietary. This university did it, or this individual, and you just can't see it. Hogwash. Okay, this is, again, a nation of the people, by the people, for the people, and if the people can't face their jury, and at this point their jury is their regulator, then we've lost everything. So it's extremely important that is applied to independent agencies as well as other executive agencies, and that we know how it's figured. Now, all of these guys on this platform all talk about those regulations having to come back through Congress. Multiple different formulas to do that. Let's find several that work and let's get them passed. And it will be a fight. Liberals on their face prefer Article 2. Why they run for the Congress, I have no idea. But their preference is always the presidency, and they want a single executive to make that decision. So they default constantly to say, that's not us, that's somebody else. I don't know if it's because it's easier and they can say a regulator did that, not us, or whatever it may be, but it's a major issue. But I would say in one final closing comment, as conservatives, we have to push solutions. When I'm at home sitting with some guys at breakfast, I can complain about problems. Up here, we have to solve it. And we can't just say it's hard, it's difficult, and so there's nothing we can do and gripe and just shoot at each other. Conservatism should be defined based on ideas and solutions, not volume and tactics. And my fear is we're starting to define conservatism based on volume and tactics rather than ideas and solutions. We will win these arguments on regulatory issues when we bring ideas and solutions rather than just volume and tactics.
Gentlemen, we're a few minutes over, and so I want to thank the panel. Please join me in thanking the panel. And I'd invite our next panel up. We're going to go right into our next session now.